Page 218. Continuing its thought, Shalamov says that the prisoner in camp could count only on the medical section, and that he could not count on the work of his own hands, that he did not dare. This led to the grave. In camp, it is not the small ration that kills, but the big one. The saying is true. The big ration is the one that kills. In one season of hauling timber, the strongest slogger would end up a hopeless last legger himself. At that point, he would be certified a temporary invalid, 14 ounces of bread and gruel from the bottom-ranking pot. During the winter, a number of such people died, while, say, 725 out of 800. The rest of them went on to light physical work and died on that. So, what other way out can we offer Ivan Denisovich if they are unwilling to take him on as a medical assistant or a hospital attendant, and also won't fake him a release from work for even one day if he is too short on schooling and too long on conscience to get himself fixed up with a job as a trustee in the camp compound? Is there any other course left to him to put his trust in his own hands? What about the rest point, the OP? What about maiming himself? And what about early release on medical grounds? Aktirovka. Let Ivan Denisovich talk about them in his own words, for he has given them plenty of thought. He had the time. The rest point, the OP, that's like a camp rest home. Tens of years, the Czechs behind their backs don't get vacations, so they have rest points for 2 weeks. They feed much better, them, and they're not driven outside the camp compound to work. And in the compound, they only put in 3-4 hours of real easy work, pounding rocks to pave roads, cleaning up the compound, or making repairs. And if there were 1,000 people in the camp, they'd open the rest point for 15. And then if everything had been divided up honestly, everyone would have gotten rest point once in just over a year. But just as there was no justice in anything in camp, there was especially none with rest points. They would open up a rest point sneakily, the way a dog snaps, and right off there would be lists ready for 3 whole shifts there. Then they would shut it down as quick as a wink, too. It wouldn't last half a year. The types who pushed in would be the bookkeepers, barbers, shoemakers, and tailors, the whole aristocracy, with just a few real sloggers thrown in for the look of the thing. The best workers, I said. And then the tailor, Baron Liam, would shove under your nose. Would shove under your nose. I made a fur coat for somebody outside, and 1,000 rubles was paid the camp cashier for it. And you, idiot, haul beams a whole month, and the camp doesn't even get 100 rubles for you. So who's the best worker? Who should get rest point? And so there you go around, your heart bleeding, trying to figure out how to get in rest point just to catch your breath a little bit. And before you look around, it has already been shut down. And that's the end of it. And the sorest point of all is that at least they could enter in your prison file that you had been at a rest point in such and such a year. It wasn't that they didn't have enough bookkeepers in camp. No, they wouldn't, because it was no good to them. The next year they'd open up a rest point again and again. Their emblem would be in the first shifts. In the first shift, and again you'd be bypassed. In the course of 10 years, they'd roll you sideways through 10 camps, and in the 10th, you'd beg them just to let you poke your nose in the OP to see what it was like, whether the walks were painted decently and so on, the walls. Because after all, you'd never been in one your whole term. But how could you prove it? No point in getting worked up about rest points. But maiming yourself was another matter. To cripple yourself, but still stay alive and become an invalid. As they say, 1 minute's endurance and a year of loafing. Break your leg and then stop the bone from knitting right. Drink salt water and swell up. And smoke tea, spoil your heart. Or drink stewed tobacco, good for wrecking the lungs. But you had to be careful. You had to be careful not to overdo hurting yourself so badly that you're leapfrogged in invalidism into the grave. And who knew just how far to go? In many ways, an invalid didn't have things too bad. He might be able to get himself a spot in a cookhouse or the based sandal shop. But the main thing smart people were looking for in making themselves invalids was early release on health grounds. As Aktirovka. Except that Aktirovka, especially in waves, was even harder than getting into rest points. They got together a commission, inspected the invalids, and for the very worst of them wrote up an act, a certificate from such and such a date, because of the state of health, so-and-so is classified as unsuited to serve out his term further, and we petition for his release. We only petition, and while the certificate proceeded upward to the higher-ups, and then back down again, you could cash in your chips. That happened often. After all, the higher-ups were sly bastards. They released ahead of time on health grounds those who were going to kick the bucket in a month anyways, and also the ones who could pay well. There was a Confederate of Caligman who had gotten away with $500,000. She paid $100,000 and went free. Not like us fools. There used to be a book going around the barracks, and the student read it aloud in their corner. In it, there was our fellow who got himself $1 million, but didn't know what to do with his $1 million under Soviet power. There wasn't supposed to be anything to buy, and you could die of starvation with it, with that $1 million. We used to laugh. Tell that bull to someone else. As for us, we've seen quite a few of those millionaires walk out of camp too. You can't buy God's health back for $1 million, but you can buy freedom, and buy power, and buy people too, lock, stock, and barrel. And there are, so many of those who have piled up millions out in freedom too, only they just don't shout it from their housetops or wave their arms about where they have it. But for the 58's, early release for help is a closed door. During all the time the camps have existed, they say that maybe 3 times for a month apiece, prisoners sentenced under Section 10 were released early for help, and then that door, too, was slammed shut, and no one will take money from them, from the enemies of the people. If you did, you'd be putting your own head on the block in place of theirs. Yes, and they don't have any money, those politicians. What do you mean, Ivan Denisovich? They don't have any? Well, all right, we don't have any. But there is one form of early release that no blue cap can take away from a prisoner. This release is death. And this is the most basic, the steadiest form of archipelago output there is, with no norms. From the fall of 1938 to February 1939, at one of the Ust-Lim camps, 385 out of 550 prisoners died. Certain work brigades of Gerstov died off totally, including the brigadiers. In the autumn of 1941, Peshawar-Lag, the railroad camp, had a listed population of 50,000 prisoners, and in the spring of 1942, 10,000. During this period, not one prisoner transport was sent out of Peshawar-Lag anywhere. So where did the 40,000 prisoners go? I have written 1,000 here in italics. Why? Because I learned these figures accidentally from a Zek who had access to them. But you would not be able to get them for all camps in all periods, nor to total them up. In the central sector of the Pure Polum camp, in the barracks housing the last laggers, in February 43, out of 50 people there were never fewer than 4 deaths a night, and one night there were 12. In the morning their places were taken by new last laggers, who dreamed out recuperating on a diet of thin magura, gruel, and 14 ounces of bread. Corpses withered from pellagra, no buttocks, and women with no breasts, or rotting from scurvy, were checked out the morgue cabinet and sometimes in the open air. This was seldom like an autopsy, a long vertical cut from neck to crotch, breaking leg bones, pulling the skull apart at its seam. Mostly it was not a surgeon but a convoy guard who verified the corpse. To be certain, the Zek was really dead and not pretending. And for this they ran the corpse through with a bayonet or smashed the skull with a big mallet. And right there they tied the big toe of the corpse's right foot, a tag with his prison file number, under which he was identified in the prison lists. At one time, they used to bury them in their underwear, but later on, in the very worst lowest grade, which was dirty gray. And then came an across-the-board regulation not to waste any underwear on them at all. It could still be used for the living, but to bury them naked. At one time in old Russia, it was thought that a corpse could not get along without a coffin. Even the lowliest serfs, beggars, and tramps were buried in coffins. Even the Sakhalin and the Akatui hard labor prisoners were buried in coffins. But in the archipelago, this would have amounted to the unproductive expenditure of millions on labor and lumber. When at Inta, after the war, one honored foreman of the woodworking plant was actually buried in a coffin. The cultural and educational section was instructed to make propaganda. Work well, and you too will be buried in a wooden coffin. The corpses were hauled away on sledges or on carts, depending on the time of year. Sometimes for convenience, they used one box for 6 corpses, and if there were no boxes, then they tied their hands and legs with a cord so they didn't flop about. And this they piled them up like logs and covered them with bast matting. There was an Emono available, a special brigade of grave diggers who would dynamite pits for them. Otherwise they had to dig the graves, always common graves, in the ground, either big ones for a large number or shallow ones for 4 at a time. In the springtime, a stink used to waft into the camp from the shallower graves, and they would send the last laggers out to deepen them. On the other hand, no one can accuse us of gas chambers. where there was more time to spare on such things, as for example in Kengir, they would set out little posts, and on the hillocks, and a representative of the records and classification section, no less, would personally inscribe on them the inventory numbers of those buried there. However, in Kengir, someone also did some wrecking. Mothers and wives who came there were shown the cemetery and then went there to mourn and weep. Thereupon the chief of Steplag, Comrade Colonel Ch7, ordered the bulldozers to bulldoze down the little grave posts and level off the hillocks because of this lack of gratitude. Now that, fair reader, is how your father, your husband, your brother was buried. And that is how the path of the native and his way of life comes to an end. But as a matter of fact, it was Pavel Bykov who said, until 24 hours have passed after death, don't be too sure that it's all over. Don't be so sure. Well, Ivan Denisovich, what is there left that we haven't yet recounted from the routine of our daily lives? Woo, you haven't even begun. It would take as many years as you serve to tell it all. Like a Balthazar who broke formation to chase a cigarette butt and the convoy guard shot him. How the invalid sacks in the kitchen gulped down raw potatoes. Once cooked, they didn't get any. How tea was used in place of money in camps. How they used to brew up a super strong tea mix, 1 3/4 ounces to a glass, and get high. But that was mostly the thieves. They used to buy tea from the free employees with stolen money. And how did a Zek manage to live on the whole? If he couldn't manage to weave string from sand, if he wasn't both tight-fisted and ingenious, he couldn't survive. Even in his sleep, the Zek had to keep thinking of how to dodge and twist his way through the next day. And if you got your hands on something or sniffed out some loophole, then keep your mouth shut. Keep it shut or else the guys next to you will find out and mess it all up. That's how it is in camp. There just isn't enough for everyone anyway. See to it there's enough for you. Well, that's as may be, but still, even in camp you have the old human custom of making friends. Not only old friendships, co-defendants or comrades from out in freedom, but new ones made here. People's hearts went out to each other and they confided in each other. Buddies. Whatever we have, we share. Whatever we don't, 50-50. It's true that we keep our precious bread rations separate, but everything got no hold of otherwise is cooked in one mess tin and ladled from the same one. There were buddies who stayed together a short time and others who stayed together a long time. Some pairings were based on conscience and others on deceit. Like a snake, the godfather used to crawl in between such friendships. Over a common mess tin in a whisper you'd talk about everything. The old Zeks admit, and the former POWs will tell you too, the one who sells you down the river is the one who ate from the mess tin with you. And that's also partial truth. But the best deal is not to have a buddy, but a girl buddy. A camp wife, a Zechka. As they used to say, to get sub-married. What was good if you were young was to blank her somewhere and in a one-night shack-up, and that would do your soul good. And even for an old, weak guy, it was still good. You could get something anyway, earn a favor. Maybe she would do your washing for you, bring you to your barracks, put your shirt under your pillow, and no one would laugh. It was in the law. She would cook for you too. You would sit down on your cot next to each other and eat. And that kind of campus spousal would suit even old chap particularly well. Just barely warm with a little touch of bitter flavor. You'd look at her through the steam from the mess pot And there were wrinkles on her face, yes, and on yours too. You were both gray and camp rags. Your padded jackets were all stained with rust and clay and lime and alabaster and lubricating grease. You never knew her before, and you had never set foot on her native soil, and she didn't talk like one of ours either. And out in freedom her children were growing up, and yours too. And she had left a husband there too, who was skirt chasing. And your own wife had been left alone too, and she wasn't letting the grass grow under her feet either. After all, 8-10 years, everyone wants to live. And this your camp wife drags the same train as you do and doesn't complain. And we live not like people, and we die not like parents. Some Zeks got visits from their real wives. In various camps under various chiefs, they were allowed to sit together for 20 minutes in the gatehouse. And there were even cases where they spent a night or two together in a separate shack, if you were a 150%er. But these visits were nothing more than poison. Why touch her with your hands and talk with her about something if you still had years and years to go on living with her again? To go before living with her again. It split the men in two. With a camp wife, everything is clear. Between us, we have 1 cup of grits left. They say we're going to get burnt sugar come this week. It won't be white, of course. The lathe operator, Radishev's wife, came to visit him, and just before she arrived, his shack-up bit the man on the neck while making love. Radishev swore a blue streak that because his wife was coming, and off he went to the medical section to get a bandage put on his bruise. I can't say I caught a cold. I can say I caught cold. And what kind of women were there in camp? There were women thieves, and there were loose women, and there were politicals, but most of them were lowly and humble women sent there under the decree. They were all sent up under the decree for theft of state property during and after the war, who crowded in all the factories full, women and girls, and who had to feed the family, they. And what were they to feed the family with? Need knows no law. And so they would pilfer. They used to put sour cream in their pockets, sneak out rolls between their legs, wind stockings around their waists, and the likeliest way was to go to work barefoot and grab new stockings there at work, put them on and wash them at home and take them to the open market to sell. Whoever produced something would swipe that. They would stick a spool of thread between their breasts. All the watchmen had been bribed, for they had to live too, and they only picked off a few hit or miss. And then the guard would jump in and there would be a body search, and it was 10 years for that shitty spool. At the same time for treason, and thousands got caught with those spools. Everyone was on the take to the extent that her work permitted it. Nastia Gurkina had it good. She used to work in the baggage cars, and she reasoned things out quite correctly. Our own Soviet people are persistent bastards, and they'll jump at your throat just for a lousy towel. Therefore, she never touched Soviet suitcases and cleaned out only foreigners. The foreigner, she said, wouldn't even think to check up on his things in time. And by the time he found out about it, he wouldn't bother to write a complaint, and all he would do was spit out Russian thieves, and he would go back to his own country. Ch7, an old bookkeeper, used to reproach Nastia. You ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're just a piece of meat. Why didn't you think up about the honor of Russia? And she would tell him off. Up yours. And stand still for it too. Why didn't you worry about victory? You used to let all those gentlemen, officers, go home and play stud dog. Ch7 had been a hospital housekeeper during the war, and the officers used to grease his palm so that he would extend their period of sick leave by forgetting their travel documents, and they could get home before returning to the front. This was very serious. Ch7 had been sentenced to be shot, and only later was his sentence commuted to a tenor. Of course, there were all kinds of unfortunate serving time as well. One woman got a 5 for fraud when her husband had died in the middle of the month, and she went on collecting his bread rations till the end of the month without turning the card in, using it for herself and her 2 children. Her neighbors informed on her out of jealousy. She served 4 years too, and 1 year was knocked off by the amnesty. And this could happen too. A house was bombed out, wife and children were killed, and the husband was left. All the ration cards were burned, but the husband was still out of his mind and lived through the whole 13 days until the end of the month without bread rations, and did not ask for a ration card for himself. Therefore, they suspected that all his ration cards were intact. They gave him 3 years, and he served 1.5 of the 3. Now, just a minute there, just a minute, Ivan Denisovich. That's all for another time. And so you are telling us about a girl, Buddy, right? About sub-marriage? She drags the same chain as you do and doesn't complain. Thank you for listening. Have a good night.